My name is Simon King. I'm an interaction designer at IDEO in Chicago, and my presentation is on tailored interactions. So there's three main points that I want to make in this presentation: that people are increasingly finding value in tailored interactions built on top of their personal data, that trends point towards a near future of data portability, a sharing of data between services that's going to enable new possibilities for personalization, and that designers should focus on empowering people with control over their data. So what do I mean when I say tailored interactions? I'm referring to interactions that are personalized to somebody based on some knowledge about them or their context. These are smart interactions, smart systems, because they're making some kind of choice on a user's behalf. And this is different than customization, where a person's making some sort of explicit choice within a very limited set of options to customize something for themselves. So tailored interactions can take many different forms and are all things that we're very much familiar with. Recommendation systems, filtering of relevant options based on some knowledge about a user, triggering of alerts and actions, intelligent defaults, auto-filling, adaptive navigation, all these things that are happening behind the scenes to personalize an experience to a particular user. And the desire for companies to know their users in this very personal and one-to-one way is something that we're really seeing across industries. This applies everywhere, whether it's financial services or health or retail. This is a growing trend across industries. So the rest of my presentation is split up into three sections that I want to discuss on this topic. The idea that there's a raw material for tailoring interactions, and that's data. And second, that there's some new capabilities around personal data mashups and the sharing of data between services. And finally, as I mentioned before, designing for control. So in this idea that raw material enables us to, the raw material of tailored interactions is data, what that data is can be quite broad, whether it's profile data, personal data about an individual, their preferences, their behavior, their history and status. It's really anything that we can use to design a behavior that's custom, personalized to them. We can explicitly ask them for it, or we can collect it in the background implicitly. And this is increasingly the type of data that's being captured about people, that you use a system and it learns something about you. So us, designers, and the companies we work for have really been focused on this, thinking about this for a long time. And I was reminded of this when I ran across this old Wired magazine from over a decade ago with this cover article about a new one-to-one relationship that we can have with our users when we're designing for them through the then new technology of cookies. And it just goes to show that we've been thinking about this for a long time. And in some ways more comfortable with it than the average person, than the public that we're designing for. Because ordinary people have had a real range of reactions to the capture and use of their personal data, and I've split that into some different phases through time: ignorance, fear, acceptance, and currently overloaded. So in the early days of the web, people were largely unaware that anything was being captured about them. And honestly, companies weren't really capturing much, or if they were, they weren't really doing much with it. And so in some ways, it was ignorance on both ends. And we entered an era of fear after that. Understanding of cookies, understanding that you're being tracked between sites that you're on, people receiving all sorts of spam, various malicious attempts to trick people, phishing attacks, making the news, and the FBI's Carnivore system, which was I think it still exists, the digital wiretapping system that the government has. Overall, all these things just led to this uncertainty around what was being captured about me, what was known about me, how was it being used. And at the same time, companies really were starting to capture a lot more data about people, and primarily using that to target advertising to them. That was really the main use. And then we entered an era of acceptance. It feels like at some point in time, everybody just gave in, like the fear kind of I don't know where the fear went, but it fell away as all sorts of services, and this is the main reason I think, lots of services that we might associate with Web 2.0, they started asking for more knowledge about you. They started requiring more knowledge about you in order to provide value. And this is the key point, that the data became a valuable asset for businesses. They started building these services around it, and it did start providing people more value beyond advertising. And so there was this era of acceptance. And today, we're really overloaded. You know, we have to manage our data on multiple different services, multiple different profiles. We have to actively monitor what is known about us. You know, you Google your name, you see who's tagged you on Facebook. It's a new type of uncertainty around what information about you is out there. But it's not like we're closing up, or we can close up or close ourselves to those services, because they're becoming increasingly important in our lives. And companies are increasingly hungry for this data about their users because they can use it to build such powerful systems. So in this desire for tailored experiences, we're not just overloaded, we're sort of moving into a state of ignorance again. And we see this in examples like, and I don't mean to pick on Twitter here because a lot of sites do this, but we see people giving up their passwords for convenience. So here's a service that's saying, give me your username and password to your email address, and I will scrape your contacts and make it easier to set up an account. And more dramatically, we're giving full access to even the most sensitive data because the aggregation services, the tailored experiences that are built on top of it are so desirable. And so this is Mint.com, where you give them all the usernames and passwords to all of your financial accounts, and they do some really cool things by aggregating that together. And it's such a valuable service that we just give those away. So my main point with that is that the demand for tailored interactions is bumping up against these problems of privacy, security, and scalability. In the world of design that's driven by personal data, it's still the designer's job to balance the pillars of people, technology, and business, like it always is. And I want to talk about some recent trends that point towards how we can improve people's control over their data while connecting products and services in new ways and creating some new opportunities. Which leads us to this section on personal data mashups. So the transition of the web from a series of pages and thinking about it in that way to a web of data, I would say that's pretty mature. This is not a new idea. We're used to the idea that there's APIs and we can create application mashups, and at least that aspect of the web of data is something that we're used to. With the rise of cloud computing and software as a service, there's all sorts of personal data about us that used to be locked up inside of our machines or inside of our local networks, and that's all moving online. So whether it's office documents or our financial information, our schedules, our address books, our medical information, our sales leads and other types of business information, shopping, whether it's what we've purchased in the past, it's what we plan to purchase, our to-do lists, our travel plans and history. This is the wonderful personal annual report that Doppler generates for you after you've used it to keep track of your travel for a whole year. Of course, photos, and ever more things are moving from inside this box to up in the cloud. But perhaps even more interesting, people are recording moments of their lives that were never before captured in any way with the help of services that live on the web and on their devices and even within their environments. And so these are things like their preferences, what their tastes in various things, their relationships, how they're connected to other people, of course their status, their location, their emotional state, their time, what they're paying attention to, their weight. I had to think of this slide when Fiona Raby was talking yesterday about the project with the scales, because this is a scales that measures your weight, uploads it to Microsoft Health Vault, and is viewable by whoever you give access to it. Exercise with the wonderful Nike Plus system that we saw this morning, RGA was talking about. Sleep. This is a forthcoming device that you might have heard of, the Fitbit, which keeps track of all of your activity throughout the day, but also while you're sleeping. So it's monitor your activity during that large part of your life. Energy usage, our driving patterns, how much gas we're using, where we're going, how we're doing it. And increasingly, we're seeing services that allow us to track literally anything we want about our lives. So this is a screenshot of the fairly new service, Datum. I think it might still be in private beta, but it allows you to just set it up to track whatever you want. And so this person is tracking the last time since they, how long it's been since they've opened a can of Diet Pepsi. So it's been almost 4 minutes. So overall, I mean, these are just a scattering of examples, but there's many more. And the amount of raw material in general for designing tailored interactions has just increased, potentially enabling new types of personal data mashups. So connecting data that lives in these different services in the same way that we did with application mashups. It's more complicated though, because the data is all online, but it's locked away. It's protected. It's not public data. Luckily, there are some new standards emerging that allow for private data to be shared securely between services. And my point is that it's really going to open up a floodgates for a new era of tailored interactions by tapping into knowledge about our users, not just that we have from within the systems we've built, but from all the systems that are capturing all these different parts of their lives. So I don't have time, and nor do I want to go into all of the technical details around that, but I do want to talk about two key technical capabilities that any system for sharing personal data would require: identification and authorization. So identification is this fundamental link that we have to have in order to correlate data. We have to know that it belongs to the same person. But every service that we use kind of acts like we're a different person. We have all these different usernames and passwords and profiles, and we're very scattered and fragmented. OpenID, which is a standard that most of you have probably heard of before because it's reached a level of maturity now, and we're starting to see it be adopted. It's a method for managing your identity in one place and then using that to authenticate yourself with multiple different services. And this is a really big step towards the web feeling like one big system rather than a bunch of fragmented ones. And exactly how it's implemented and things like that, we're still in the early days of that, but this is one of the standards that gives me hope. The next step in the process is authorization, or actually granting the access to your personal data. So the standard that I'm interested in here is called OAuth, and there's others, but OAuth is the one that I think is most interesting right now. It handles the authorization of protected data, and the metaphor that I've heard for it that I really like is that it's a digital valet key. So just like you can have a key for your car that only allows it to be driven, but not access to the trunk or the glove box. OAuth allows for partial rather than blanket access to your personal data. So a couple diagrams just to make that point very clear how it works. If you hand over your username and password like you do in the previous example of Twitter and Mint, it's blanket authorization. You're giving your username and password to service A, they're impersonating you, and they're getting all of your data from service B. They have complete access because they're impersonating you. Whereas with OAuth, it allows for partial authorization and control. So you can see that the person sits in between. Service A asks for permission to use a subset of data from service B with certain restrictions in place. And because the user's in the middle of that, they can see what's being accessed, they can see when it's being accessed, they could revoke that permission, they could change what that authorization is, and it's an environment of control. So OAuth in particular, I think, is going to be one of the big catalysts for widespread sharing of protected data. This is something that has been fragmented with a bunch of different standards, and this is the one that's coming together to give me hope that this is something we're going to be all very familiar with in the coming future. So it's showing up first in web applications, but it can really apply to desktop, to mobile, to any internet-connected device that wants to access data that's living in another service. And there's one more piece of sort of the technology puzzle that I want to address, and that's distributed social networking, which is really just this term that's emerged recently in reference to all these different platforms that you see here. All the major players have released their own platforms for personal data sharing. So things like Facebook Connect and Google Friend Connect. And what's happening here is that each of these companies is recognizing this trend, and they want to be the trusted gateway for your identification and authorization. They want to be the one you go to. Most of them are approaching it from an open and standards-based perspective, and so they're using things like OpenID and OAuth and other standards that roll up collectively into this term, the open stack. Whereas others, and within the context of that list, I'm really just referring to Facebook, are taking a more closed proprietary approach. So standards versus proprietary, that's not really the issue. The more interesting thing is they're fundamentally differing viewpoints, and there's pros and cons of both, but I think it's just important to recognize the different viewpoints that are in play here. So there's the concept of a centralized U, where all of your data is being stored in one place. This is the Facebook model, and then third parties can come in and access that and use it to tailor your experience on their particular service. This is different than the decentralized U, where there's all this data about you that lives out in whatever service it was collected and is being shared out. And so this is much more of a network model. Any of the nodes can access any of the other nodes. It's much more of an ecosystem. So it takes us to the final section, this notion of designing for control. And there's a really wonderful talk by Kevin Kelly. If you haven't heard this, if you haven't watched it yet, it's a video on the TED website. I encourage you to go do so. It's called Predicting the Next 5,000 Days of the Web. And I enjoy the talk. I find it inspiring, but there's this thing that Kelly says. He says total personalization will require total transparency. And this is a really sort of frightening idea to me, and it reminds me of a panopticon prison, this prison design where you're constantly, or you can be constantly observed, but you're not sure if you are. And so to me, this is a state of paranoia. And the emergence of standards like OAuth, which is just kind of a small thing, but really just the fact that there is momentum and conversation around this idea of how can we securely share protected data so that it can be used by everybody, gives me hope that Kelly's vision of total personalization could be realized without such a complete collapse of privacy. But that's sort of a technical thing, and beyond the technical capabilities, we need to think about how we can create tailored interactions that are ethical and human-centered. And a lot of that boils down to privacy. And privacy is one of those really slippery words that means many different things in many contexts and to different people. It's often described in terms of anonymity when talking about data and usage of a system. But that's not a very useful definition to us in thinking of it as a material for design, because unless it's tied to a particular person, it can't be that material that we want it to be. And so I find a more relevant definition to be the choice to reveal oneself selectively. So I think that this sense of control, this sense of choice over how personal data is used, shared, and destroyed should really be the next step in people's relationship to data collection and use about them. And so we should move from an era of overload into an era of control rather than slipping backwards towards any sort of ignorance. And when we design systems that include some kind of tailored experience, some kind of tailored interaction. There's certain questions that I think any system we design should be able to answer. And they're along with the lines that I just laid out. How is my data used? What do you know about me? How do you know it? How current is this data? How can I change it? And how is it being used to personalize my experience? Put some transparency around that. How is my data being shared? This is kind of the crux of the OAuth diagram that we just went through. What do you know about me that's from other places? And how is that being collected? What's being collected about me that I could share out and you could contribute to that ecosystem so that I could use it elsewhere? What data is currently shared with other people? How is data about me being included in some sort of aggregate data set? And do I have any control over that? And finally, how can my data be destroyed? So how can I change what you know about me or stop sharing my data or just remove it? And if it is removed, does it still exist in the other systems that I've shared it with? So there's a lot of problems to solve here. There's the potential for creating new types of uncertainty when we begin sharing our data between systems. And so a lot to work on. But specific examples of how you might do that, I think are really just beyond the scope of this particular presentation, both for length and the fact that I consider this sort of a next step for myself, but also for anyone in this room that's interested in this topic. I think we need to develop interaction design patterns and some best practices around this idea of designing for control within an environment where we're dealing with personal data mashups and sharing of data between systems. So some additional principles. These are it's kind of an extra slide, if you will, but it's things that I just developed while thinking about this topic and working through this. The idea that systems we design should fail gracefully. So if we're designing interactions that rely on shared data, what happens when that data is no longer available? In a way, we're building a fragile system because we're relying on things from other places. And what kind of reasonable fallback can we include? This idea of not building bubbles, so letting people choose between that tailored experience and the more collective one, so that we don't create an environment where all the information people have, everything that they're doing is so customized, so personalized to them that we sort of miss out on those serendipitous connections or that collective experience. Sharing your toys is the idea that I could see a lot of companies excited about getting data from elsewhere, but I think it's important to be a good member of this ecosystem that's emerging. And if you're collecting things that could be useful for your users to give to their other services and make use of, you should share that back out. So give and take. And finally, that you need to provide an exit. So allowing people to share the information you know about them is one thing, but allowing them to pack up and leave and take their data with them is sort of a final step in that consideration. The final point that I want to make is that we also need to get involved in policy discussions that are happening with privacy and consumer advocacy groups. You see a couple examples at the bottom of the screen of groups that I know are doing a lot in this space. There's many more. But the current lobbying really tends to focus on anonymizing data, deleting data after a certain period of retention. And I think that it's primarily because they're focused on this use of data for advertising and for marketing. And like we talked about before, if you anonymize data or if you delete it, it can't be a material for design anymore. So we need to engage in these conversations. I think that there's a lot of good thinking and a lot of good policy discussions, but we need to broaden that conversation to include the idea that this is a material for design, and that one way to approach it is by giving people control rather than just deleting that data. So in conclusion, there's new possibilities for tailored interactions that are emerging through the mashup of personal data. It's our responsibility to empower our users with control over their data, and we need to define the patterns and principles that are going to support this goal and get involved in policy that can address data usage beyond advertising. So thank you very much.